So the goal with this next layer is to get in as many variations of shape as I can by subtly changing color rather than value. My lighter values will come in when I'm doing the highlights on his little nose. But first I see that I've got some areas like here and down here where the color is darker than other areas of his face. And it's a little more of that cooler color that I've mixed up. I'm going to see if I can leave my photo sitting here without it getting in the way and still be able to see it. I'm used to holding it in my hand, so I may end up doing that yet. And a lot of these colors on the lips, and it's the same even with adult lips, sometimes the skin color almost seems to go right over the lip color. We don't always have a huge variation of value or color in our lips compared to our skin. This is getting a little awkward, so I'm going to have to move my photo and hold it in my hand again. But I will show it to you periodically so you can see where we're going. These changes are all very subtle so far. And I'll only leave the dark where I really know it has to be. And this dark isn't even that dark. It's not even, it's like a value 5 or something. So it's only really quite dark right along there. And even then, maybe not as dark as I've already got. Okay, I'm going to take that photo down and work on it holding it. It'll make life easier. So it was a little bit awkward trying to work around by camera so I don't bump into it. In here, we get a little reflection from in his blanket, and it gets quite green. But I have to make sure it's not too dark, which will be easy to lighten later if I do get too dark with it. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is in this case to pre-mix your colors. I don't know if it would be possible to paint this portrait in this subtle detail without having all your colors pre-mixed so that you could just dip back and forth in them. If you ever get in a situation where you really can't save your colors, you have to wait too long before you go back to the painting, and you're doing a subtle portrait like this, it's just going to take you longer to get pre-mixed again. And as you come over, if the colors are close, they will scumble in and be okay. But it's so much easier if you can do it all in one here. These variations are so subtle, it's hard to get them just right, and it's very easy to get them too dark. But I do have another layer or two that's going to be lighter. This little slit in his eye, I used one of my darker colors to paint. But I'm going to go over part of it with a little bit of a reddish color that's lighter. Because he just has such soft little eyes yet. You're better to make it too soft than too harsh with a child. It just won't look young enough. I did a painting, one of my first acrylics was a member of the RCMP musical ride, and most of the guys at that time on the ride were about 25 years old. And I did this portrait, and the face on the portrait was about the size of this face, so not very big. Quite a complex thing to tackle, as I was just getting into acrylics. And at the time I was painting in shopping malls, so people were watching as they went by. And a lot of times the regular staff in the mall would come back on a regular basis and have a look, and day to day. I worked on it for weeks. I think it took me probably 3 or 4 weeks to do. So the face itself, I probably worked on it all week. And as I was getting it finished, he looked too old. He looked to be about 45 years old, and I couldn't see that necessarily. He did a little bit of it. I started asking people, how old is this man? And they were guessing about 45. So I started softening. Just gradually taking away variation between dark and light. And I kept softening, much like I'm doing with these lips here, where I'm just kind of painting a lighter color over where I had a darker demarcation. And I kept asking people, how old is this guy? And when they got to 25, that's when I knew I had accomplished what I wanted to do. But it did take a lot more softening than I thought it would. And that little trick sometimes works too with if you're having a little bit of trouble with a likeness. You can kind of sometimes soften it away, and the viewer's eye will fill it in. And if you're doing a commission, occasionally just softening it will make them suddenly say, oh yes, that's much better, it looks just like them. And it's only because you've taken away variations so that their eye will fill in what they want to see. And that's a great little thing that our eyes work that way, that you can gradually soften and the eye takes over and fills in. But it can also work against you, because as you're painting a portrait or anything, it's so easy to get lost in it and not see where it needs a change. And that's one of the reasons I always make sure that I judge the likeness and the main shapes right at the start, before your eyes get so accustomed to seeing it that you lose your objectivity. And that's also another reason why it's so good to step back from your painting really often. And as much as lips are, we tend to see them as outlined lips, they really aren't. They almost blend into the skin, especially with the young. So once I've got most of my variations in, I go over it again with that one color that I've pre-mixed as my main face color. And then I will sit back and judge it again. See where it needs to be changed. As the colors get a little more subtle and more opaque here, it's much easier to judge. I'm using a fine grain linen canvas. And that's important because the canvas will create some of the texture done by the scumbling. By dragging the paint over, that's how you get some of the blending, is the canvas will pick it up in some places, but not in every place. So if my canvas was coarser, I couldn't possibly get the same kind of detail and subtlety that I can with a canvas that is softer, or smoother, I mean. And the reverse is also true. If what you're looking for is a little more painterly look, a little looser, try a canvas that is coarser. And I'm using linen. I really like the linen because the texture isn't quite as rigid. There are little nubby variations in the texture. This is one of those canvas boards that I made in that video I showed a while back. I will come on again with lighter colors for the highlights, but first I'm going over and creating the opacity I need here. Making sure that I'm getting some variation in shape without going too dark. And again, because the colors tend to dry darker, it really does take sitting back and looking after everything has dried. One of the challenges of acrylics. I want to make sure, the reason I'm painting over the whole thing again, is I want to make sure that everything is equally opaque. Especially reds and yellows and oranges look quite a bit warmer when they're transparent or translucent. So I want to make sure that the whole thing is even in terms of how opaque the paint is applied. There are still a few areas that are a little more translucent, but I'll keep going. There will be several layers to this little guy. That's how I'm going to create this illusion of a soft blended portrait. Getting slightly greener over here because again we're getting reflections from his little blanket. And here's a little reflected light that isn't picking up on the blanket. So these are very subtle changes. And again, reassessing whether it's too dark along edges. This is the time to lighten them before you start gradually blending something lighter and lighter and lighter and realize you started out too dark. Because all my colors are pre-mixed, it's very easy to come back and say, oh no, I lightened too much. Let me go back to the darker color if I should so desire.